For 18 years, Ethan Walker grew up in a house where silence was louder than any raised voice. And on the day of his father's memorial service, his mother still believed that silence had protected him. The church in suburban Ohio smelled faintly of polished wood and lilies, the kind ordered in bulk from the same florist that had handled every Walker family wedding and holiday arrangement for the past 3 decades. Sunlight filtered through stained glass and cast pale blue and red shadows across the aisle as guests filled the pews, whispering about Robert Walker's steady career, his dedication, his discipline. Margaret Walker sat in the front row, spine straight, hands folded neatly over a black leather purse she'd owned for years, her silver blonde hair pinned back with careful precision. At 62, she carried herself like a woman who believed she had done her best. She greeted neighbors with a tight smile and thanked them for coming, her voice measured, composed, almost rehearsed. Ethan stood near the back of the sanctuary, 6 feet tall now, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him well enough to suggest success without arrogance. At 38, he had built a life 3 states away, a quiet consulting business, a townhome with a view of a narrow river, routines that were orderly and controlled. He rarely returned home. When he did, he stayed in hotels. Today, he had agreed to speak. Margaret had insisted. It would mean so much, she had told him over the phone, her tone soft but expectant, as though this was simply another family obligation like Thanksgiving dinner or 4th of July fireworks on the lawn. Ethan had paused before answering, staring at the skyline outside his office window, watching traffic crawl along the interstate. "I'll say a few words," he had replied, his voice calm, almost gentle. Now, as the organ music faded and the pastor cleared his throat, Margaret turned slightly in her seat to look for her son. Their eyes met for a brief second across the room. She searched his face for grief, for something tender, something that would reassure her that time had done what she always believed it would do: smooth the edges, soften the past, turn it into something manageable. But Ethan's expression was unreadable. Not cold, not angry, just steady. The pastor began speaking about Robert's work ethic, about long hours and firm principles, about how he had pushed those around him to be better. A few people nodded. Margaret dabbed at the corner of her eye with a folded tissue, careful not to smudge her makeup. She had practiced this kind of composure for years. From the outside, the Walkers had always looked like the kind of family you'd expect to see on a Christmas card. Trimmed hedges, fresh paint on the shutters, a flag on the porch that was replaced every Memorial Day. What no one in the pews could see was the quiet pattern that had shaped Ethan's childhood. The closed doors, the long evenings spent in his room, the way conversations stopped when footsteps approached. Margaret had convinced herself that maintaining peace required endurance. She had believed that if she kept everything orderly, the laundry folded, the dinners warm, the smiles ready, then whatever tension lingered in the air would eventually dissolve. She had told herself that boys grew stronger through hardship, that discipline built character, that families survived by not pulling at threads too hard. When the pastor finally said Ethan's name, a subtle shift moved through the congregation. Ethan walked forward without hesitation, his shoes making soft, deliberate sounds against the polished floor. He adjusted the microphone slightly, glanced once at the closed casket, and then at the audience. Margaret held her breath, certain she knew what was coming: gratitude, respect, maybe even forgiveness wrapped in polite phrases. She did not yet understand that the silence she had protected for 18 years had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting for a room like this, filled with witnesses. The room felt smaller once Ethan's hands settled on the edges of the podium, as though the air itself had decided to lean in and listen. He adjusted the microphone with slow precision, the faint feedback hum fading as he found the right distance. From the front row, Margaret watched him with a mixture of anticipation and unease. She had always believed she understood her son's silences. As a child, he had been quiet in ways that made teachers describe him as mature. As a teenager, he had retreated into books and late-night study sessions, claiming he preferred the calm of his room to the noise of the television downstairs. Margaret had interpreted that quiet as resilience. She had told neighbors that Ethan was independent, that he did not need constant reassurance. In her mind, quiet meant strong. Standing before the congregation now, Ethan let his gaze travel across the faces in the pews. Former co-workers of his father sat in pressed suits, their programs folded neatly on their laps. Neighbors who had borrowed tools and exchanged holiday cookies nodded at him with polite sympathy. They expected gratitude. They expected a son honoring a father's legacy. Margaret folded her tissue into smaller and smaller squares between her fingers, remembering the early years in that same house on Maple Ridge Drive. The white siding had been freshly painted when they moved in. The lawn had stretched wide and green, almost half an acre, enough space for a swing set and a small vegetable garden. She had believed they were building something stable, something solid. On summer evenings, she had stood at the kitchen window washing dishes while Ethan played in the backyard. Robert would sit at the dining table reviewing bills, occasionally offering sharp instructions about chores, about posture, about effort. Margaret had told herself that structure was necessary. She had repeated that word so often it became a shield. Structure, discipline, order. The pastor stepped aside completely, giving Ethan the full space at the front of the sanctuary. A faint cough echoed from somewhere in the back row. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, tires humming against asphalt. Ethan cleared his throat once, not out of nerves, but out of intention, as though he wanted every syllable to land exactly where it belonged. Margaret searched his face again for softness. She wanted to see the boy who used to line up his toy cars by size across the living room carpet. She wanted to see the teenager who earned a scholarship and packed his belongings into 2 medium-sized suitcases the day he left for college. Instead, she saw a man who had learned to measure his words carefully. She remembered the night he drove away at 18, headlights sweeping across the garage door as she stood on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself against the Ohio cold. She had thought distance would heal what time had not. She had thought adulthood would rewrite memory. Now, as Ethan drew in a steady breath and looked directly at the casket, Margaret felt something unfamiliar press against her composure. It was not grief. It was not pride. It was the quiet realization that the version of the past she had rehearsed for decades might not be the one her son was about to share. He did not begin with praise. He did not begin with gratitude. Instead, Ethan let the silence stretch just long enough for the room to grow uncomfortable. And then he spoke in a voice that carried clearly to the back pew without rising above a calm, steady tone. He said that growing up in the Walker house had taught him many things, and that not all lessons came wrapped in kindness. A subtle ripple moved through the congregation, a shifting of shoulders, a glance exchanged between 2 former co-workers of Robert who had expected a familiar story about hard work and firm guidance. Margaret felt her fingers tighten around her purse. She told herself he was simply building toward something positive. She told herself he would circle back to honor. Ethan continued, explaining that as a boy he had learned to measure the sound of footsteps in the hallway, to recognize the difference between a door closing gently and a door closing with finality. He spoke about how a child can become an expert in reading a room, in adjusting his tone, in shrinking his presence to keep peace intact. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He described patterns the way a consultant might describe a business cycle, precise and detached. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks as memories surfaced without invitation. Evenings when she had lingered at the stove a little longer than necessary. Moments when she had convinced herself that stepping in would only escalate tension. She had told herself that silence prevented damage. She had believed that staying composed was the same as protecting her son. Ethan glanced briefly toward the front row, his gaze landing on his mother for only a second before returning to the audience. He said that children often believe what they are shown repeatedly. If they are shown that discomfort is normal, they accept it. If they are shown that their feelings are inconvenient, they learn to hide them. He described sitting at the edge of his bed at 10 years old, staring at a glow in the dark sticker on the ceiling, promising himself that one day he would live in a place where doors did not make his heart race. A murmur passed through the pews. Someone shifted in their seat. The pastor lowered his eyes to the program in his hands. Margaret felt as though the church walls had inched closer, the stained glass colors no longer soft but sharp. She remembered telling Ethan that his father only wanted him to succeed. She remembered saying that families stayed together by enduring difficult seasons. She had repeated those phrases until they sounded like truth. Ethan said that resilience is often praised without asking what it cost. He said that discipline can be confused with fear, and that a child does not always know the difference. He paused again, not for effect, but to let the words settle. The air felt heavier now, no longer filled with polite sympathy, but with something closer to recognition. Margaret understood, with a slow and creeping clarity, that her son was not rewriting the past. He was simply describing it from where he had been standing all along. The sanctuary no longer felt like a place of routine comfort, but like a room where something long buried was rising to the surface. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the sides of the podium, not gripping it, not leaning on it, simply anchoring himself in the present. He said that growing up, he had believed every family functioned the same way, that every home carried a tension children learned to navigate without naming. He spoke about report card nights at the kitchen table, about how numbers on a page could determine the atmosphere for the entire week. He described the way he used to rehearse conversations in his head before speaking, calculating which words would keep everything level, which tone would prevent disappointment from spreading across the room. Margaret felt her breath shorten as images she had carefully filed away resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity. She remembered Ethan standing in the doorway of the living room, shoulders slightly hunched, waiting for approval that never seemed complete. She remembered telling him to try harder, to not take things personally, to understand that expectations were a form of love. She had believed that explanation was enough. She had believed that if she translated her husband's intensity into softer language, it would somehow lessen the weight. Ethan continued, explaining that a child does not question the rules of his home. He adapts. He learns that silence can be safer than argument, that agreement can be safer than honesty. He said that he became very good at reading subtle cues, at noticing when a fork was placed down too firmly on a plate, when a sigh carried more meaning than words. He said he learned to disappear in plain sight, to keep his opinions folded neatly like shirts in a dresser drawer. A few heads in the congregation lowered. The description felt uncomfortably familiar, not because they knew specifics, but because many recognized the pattern of shrinking to survive expectations. Margaret's eyes remained fixed on her son's profile. She remembered the school guidance counselor once suggesting that Ethan seemed anxious. She had dismissed it gently, insisting that he was simply driven, that high standards produced strong character. She had repeated that phrase so often it felt like scripture. Now it sounded thin. Ethan said that when he left for college at 18, he believed distance would change everything. He described packing his belongings into 2 suitcases, measuring exactly 50 pounds each to avoid extra airline fees, as though precision could guarantee freedom. He said that in his dorm room, 300 miles from Maple Ridge Drive, he noticed something unexpected. The quiet there felt different. It was not heavy. It did not demand performance. It simply existed. He paused again, letting the contrast settle in the room. Margaret felt a quiet tremor in her hands, the first crack in the composure she had practiced for years. She realized that the life she had called stable might have felt entirely different from the inside of her son's bedroom door. The air in the church had shifted completely now, no longer wrapped in polite remembrance, but stretched thin by recognition. Ethan allowed another quiet pause, not dramatic, not theatrical, simply necessary. He said that when he first arrived at college, he did not know what to do with peace. He described sitting in his dorm room late at night, hearing laughter down the hallway, doors opening and closing without tension, voices rising and falling without consequence. He said he realized then that his body had been bracing for something that never came. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She had imagined that college had been a clean break for him, a fresh start built on the foundation she believed she had preserved. She had told friends that her son was thriving because of the values he had been raised with. She had never asked what those values felt like from his side of the dinner table. Ethan continued in the same even tone, explaining that distance did not erase memory. It only clarified it. He said that in his early 20s, he began to notice how quickly he apologized in conversations, how often he minimized his own opinions before anyone else could dismiss them. He noticed how silence still felt safer than disagreement. He described attending a leadership workshop at work years later where the instructor asked participants to identify the first place they learned about authority. Ethan said that question lingered with him for weeks. He did not blame. He did not accuse. He simply said that children often interpret endurance as normal because they are told that loyalty means not questioning the structure of their home. Margaret shifted in her seat, her black heels pressing firmly against the church floor. She remembered countless evenings when she had reassured herself that keeping the household intact was the highest priority. She had measured success by the absence of public conflict, by how neatly the neighbors viewed their family. She had mistaken quiet compliance for harmony. Ethan glanced toward her again, this time holding her gaze for a fraction longer. He said that as adults, people often revisit their childhood not to rewrite it, but to understand it. He said he spent years convincing himself that what happened inside their house was simply strict parenting, that high expectations justified discomfort. But he realized that love without safety leaves a different kind of mark. The congregation remained still, the weight of his words settling slowly rather than exploding. Margaret felt the edges of her certainty begin to dissolve. She had believed that by staying composed, by not escalating tension, she had been protecting her son from something worse. She had told herself that her silence was strategic, even compassionate. Now, sitting beneath the stained glass windows, she began to understand that silence can also communicate permission. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, not in shame, but in reflection. He said that the hardest part of growing up was not the pressure itself. It was learning later that someone else in the room had known, had seen, and had chosen stillness. The statement hung in the air without accusation, yet it carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. The words did not echo, yet they settled into every corner of the sanctuary with quiet precision. Ethan remained steady at the podium, his posture relaxed, his tone unchanged. He said that when he began therapy in his early 30s, he did not go because he felt broken. He went because he felt tired. Tired of anticipating reactions before speaking. Tired of interpreting neutral expressions as warnings. He described sitting in a small office with beige walls and a clock that ticked softly above a bookshelf, realizing that he had spent years managing other people's comfort while ignoring his own. He said that for a long time he believed maturity meant endurance. He believed strength meant absorbing tension without complaint. Margaret felt the word therapy land heavier than anything before it. She had never imagined her son in a room like that. In her mind, therapy belonged to other families. Families that did not maintain appearances. Families that let problems spill into public view. She had taken pride in the fact that their household functioned without outside intervention. Now she understood that functioning and flourishing were not the same thing. Ethan continued, explaining that his therapist once asked him a simple question: who stood beside you when things felt overwhelming? He said he struggled to answer. Not because there had been no one physically present, but because presence and protection are not identical. The congregation remained silent, the faint hum of the air conditioning system the only interruption. Margaret felt as though that question had been placed directly in her lap. She remembered evenings when she had lingered in the hallway outside Ethan's room, listening for signs that everything had settled. She had told herself that as long as the house returned to quiet, the situation had resolved. She had measured safety by the absence of noise rather than by the presence of reassurance. Ethan said that adulthood brought clarity in unexpected ways. He described visiting friends' homes and noticing small gestures that once seemed insignificant. A parent placing a hand on a child's shoulder during a difficult conversation. A mother stepping forward instead of stepping back when voices grew tense. He realized then that silence is not neutral. Silence communicates alignment. Silence signals which side of a moment someone chooses. Margaret's breath caught, though she did not move. She had convinced herself for decades that remaining calm was a form of mediation. She had believed that if she did not escalate a situation, she was helping it dissolve. Now she recognized that stillness can sometimes feel like agreement to the person waiting for support. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before lifting them again, meeting the congregation with calm honesty. He said that healing does not require rewriting history. It requires naming it. And sometimes naming it means acknowledging not only what was done, but what was allowed. The words rested between him and his mother like a mirror neither could turn away from. Margaret could feel the shift in the room as clearly as she once felt a change in weather before a summer storm. No one interrupted. No one coughed now. Ethan remained composed, his voice measured, never rising above the respectful tone expected in a church. He said that for many years he carried a quiet question with him, one he never asked out loud. He wondered what might have been different if, just once, someone had stepped beside him instead of observing from a distance. He explained that as a child, he did not expect perfection from adults. He only expected alignment. He expected that if something felt overwhelming, someone would acknowledge it without minimizing it. He described sitting at the edge of the dining table at 12 years old, staring at a plate of untouched food, trying to calculate whether speaking honestly would make things worse or better. He learned quickly that silence kept the evening shorter. Margaret closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, remembering those dinners. She remembered the way she used to tidy the kitchen after, wiping the same counter twice, convincing herself that the household had returned to normal. She had defined normal as quiet. Ethan continued, saying that children often interpret patterns as rules. If they see one parent step back consistently, they assume stepping back is the correct response. He said he did not blame his mother for every moment, but he could not ignore the accumulation of them. Accumulation, he repeated softly, as though the word itself carried weight. It was not one evening. It was years of evenings. It was not one conversation. It was a pattern of them. The pastor shifted slightly in his seat, his hands folded tighter in his lap. Several guests avoided eye contact altogether. Margaret felt the ground beneath her certainty loosen further. She had believed that endurance equaled loyalty. She had believed that preserving the image of a united front was the same as preserving safety. Ethan said that in therapy, he learned something that unsettled him at first. He learned that children who adapt too well often grow into adults who struggle to identify their own needs. He said he spent his 20s excelling at work, meeting deadlines, managing clients, because structure felt familiar. But when it came to relationships, he hesitated. He questioned his instincts. He apologized too quickly. He described how he once ended a serious relationship because he could not recognize when his boundaries were being crossed. He simply defaulted to silence. The congregation listened, not out of obligation now, but because something in his calm delivery demanded reflection. Margaret's hands trembled slightly in her lap. She realized that while she had been measuring success by appearances, her son had been measuring safety by absence. Ethan finally looked directly at her again, not with anger, but with clarity. He said that the most complicated part of his childhood was not the pressure itself. It was understanding that the person who could have changed the atmosphere chose to maintain it instead. The statement was quiet. It was steady, and it left no room for misinterpretation. Tioi with grave nbnoi dung chuin thun, a with circumflex m, ton the air inside the sanctuary felt almost fragile now, as if even a single careless movement could fracture what had already shifted. Ethan remained composed, neither rushing nor retreating from the space he occupied. He said that after leaving home at 18, he built a life that looked stable from the outside. He worked long hours during his first years after college, taking on projects no one else wanted, answering emails at 6 in the morning, staying late in office buildings lit only by fluorescent lights and the glow of computer screens. He told himself that success would prove something. He was not entirely sure what it needed to prove, only that it had to be earned repeatedly. He described buying his first car outright at 26, a modest sedan with 120,000 miles on it, and feeling a sense of control he had not known as a child. He described signing the mortgage papers for his townhome at 32, the stack of documents nearly half an inch thick, and realizing that stability could be chosen rather than endured. Margaret listened as though each milestone was a chapter she had only skimmed. She had celebrated his promotions over the phone. She had mailed him birthday cards with neat handwriting and brief notes about the weather in Ohio. She had believed that distance meant healing. She had believed that because he did not confront her, he had forgiven her. Ethan continued, explaining that even in success, certain habits lingered. He would rehearse difficult conversations with employees before meetings, anticipating criticism that rarely came. He would apologize instinctively when a project encountered obstacles, even when responsibility did not rest solely on him. It took years, he said, to recognize that he was still responding to an atmosphere that no longer existed. He said that growth is not only about building something new. It is about unlearning what once felt necessary. Margaret's composure thinned further as she understood the implication beneath his calm delivery. The patterns he described had roots. They had been planted long before he opened his first business account or moved 3 states away. Ethan said that he does not share these details to rewrite his father's entire identity. He acknowledges that his father worked hard, provided a house, paid bills on time. But provision without emotional safety leaves questions unanswered. He looked toward the casket briefly, then back at the congregation. He said that adulthood gave him tools he did not have as a child. It gave him language. It gave him perspective. It gave him the courage to examine what had been normalized. Margaret felt the weight of that word, normalized. She had normalized tension. She had normalized stepping back. She had normalized telling herself that things would improve with time. Ethan finished this part of his reflection with steady clarity. He said that building a stable life does not erase the need to acknowledge how instability once shaped you. And pretending that silence protected everyone only ensures that someone carries the cost alone. The church felt smaller with each measured sentence, as though the walls themselves were listening. Ethan did not look away from the congregation now. He allowed his words to rest in the open space between himself and the people who had known his family for decades. He said that when he received the call about his father's heart attack, he was standing in his kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold beside the sink. It was a Tuesday morning. He had a meeting scheduled at 9:30. The call came at 8:14. Margaret's voice had sounded fragile, almost unfamiliar. For a brief moment, he felt the old reflex return, the instinct to steady someone else before steadying himself. He told her he would come. He booked a flight within an hour. He packed a single suitcase this time, smaller than the ones he carried at 18. He said that on the plane ride back to Ohio, he expected to feel something decisive. Anger, sadness, relief. Instead, he felt clarity. The kind that arrives when there is no longer a possibility of future change. He understood that whatever conversation he once imagined having with his father would never happen. There would be no acknowledgement, no revision, no apology, and that realization did not shatter him. It steadied him. Margaret listened as though each detail reopened a moment she had lived but never examined. She remembered calling him from the kitchen, the same room where she had spent years measuring silence. She had assumed that death would equal closure. She had believed that finality might soften everything that had once felt sharp. Ethan continued, explaining that on the drive from the airport to the house on Maple Ridge Drive, he noticed how small the neighborhood looked. The lawns were trimmed, the mailboxes unchanged. The house itself stood exactly as it had years ago, white siding, dark shutters, a flag on the porch. From the outside, nothing suggested complexity. He walked through the front door and was greeted by familiar smells, furniture in the same positions, photographs lining the hallway. It felt preserved, almost staged. Margaret had hugged him tightly that afternoon, her arms lingering as if she feared he might disappear again. He had hugged her back, gently, carefully. He said that in the days leading up to the service, he watched his mother move through the house with quiet efficiency. She organized documents. She folded black clothing over the backs of chairs. She accepted casseroles from neighbors with polite gratitude. He recognized the pattern. Composure, order, stillness. The same strategy she had relied on for years. He said he understood then that this ceremony was not only about remembering a life. It was about deciding whether silence would continue. Unchallenged, Margaret felt the truth of that settle heavily. She realized that while she had hoped this gathering would reinforce a narrative of unity, her son had arrived with something else entirely. He had not come to rewrite history in anger. He had come to name it without raising his voice. And that difference was more unsettling than any confrontation could have been. Margaret could feel the final layer of certainty slipping away as Ethan continued, his tone unchanged, his posture steady. He said that during the week he spent back in Ohio before the service, he walked through the house alone one evening while his mother slept. He moved slowly down the hallway, past framed photographs that captured vacations and birthdays, frozen smiles and coordinated outfits. He paused outside his old bedroom door, his hand resting briefly on the handle before turning it. The room looked smaller than he remembered. The twin bed was still pressed against the same wall. The bookshelf remained in the corner, holding high school trophies and a few college textbooks he never took with him. Dust had settled along the edges of the desk. He stood there quietly, not overwhelmed, not angry, simply observant. He said that standing in that room as an adult felt like reviewing a chapter of his life that had been carefully edited. The visible details suggested normalcy. What was missing was harder to photograph. Margaret remembered that room differently. She remembered folding laundry at the foot of that bed. She remembered knocking softly before entering, asking about homework, reminding him about dinner. She had measured her involvement by presence. She had believed that being physically there meant she was doing enough. Ethan explained that memory is selective and that families often hold different versions of the same house. He said that in his version, the room had felt like a retreat, a place where he could regulate his breathing, where he could calculate responses before stepping back into shared space. He did not describe dramatic moments. He described patterns. The way he kept the light on longer than necessary. The way he avoided certain topics at the dinner table. The way he learned to read tension the way other children learned to read books. The congregation remained silent, not out of discomfort now, but out of recognition that this was not an outburst. It was a reconstruction. Margaret felt a quiet ache settle in her chest. She had always assumed that because there were no public scandals, no visible chaos, their family had been intact. She had equated absence of noise with absence of harm. Ethan said that while preparing for this service, he asked himself whether speaking honestly would serve any purpose. He could have chosen the familiar script. He could have praised hard work, discipline, tradition. No one would have questioned it. The room would have nodded politely. They would have returned to their cars believing they understood the Walker family. But he realized that repeating a comfortable narrative would only extend the silence he had carried since childhood. He lifted his gaze again toward his mother, not with hostility, but with resolve. He said that this moment was not about humiliation. It was about clarity. And clarity, even when uncomfortable, is a form of respect. The sanctuary remained still, yet the stillness no longer felt passive. It felt attentive. Ethan allowed his gaze to rest on the congregation one more time before continuing, his voice steady and deliberate. He said that as he stood in his childhood bedroom earlier that week, he realized something unexpected. He did not feel anger toward the walls. He did not feel bitterness toward the furniture. He felt distance. The kind of distance that forms when a child adapts so completely that he forgets what it would have felt like to be defended. He explained that children do not articulate disappointment the way adults do. They internalize it. They translate it into behavior. They become quiet. They become agreeable. They become efficient at reading moods. He said that for years he believed that was maturity. It took decades to understand it was survival. Margaret felt the word settle like a verdict. Survival. She had never once described her household in those terms. She had described it as structured, traditional, disciplined. She had told herself that every family had tension, that endurance was part of commitment. Now she understood that endurance without intervention can feel like isolation. Ethan continued, saying that he does not stand here today seeking apology from someone who can no longer respond. He understands that the final chapter of his father's life has already been written. What remains unwritten is how silence will be remembered. He said that he wrestled with whether speaking honestly would cause unnecessary pain. He considered protecting his mother's comfort. He considered allowing the ceremony to pass with polite statements and rehearsed gratitude. But he realized that protecting comfort at the expense of truth is the same pattern he lived with for 18 years. The congregation shifted subtly, absorbing the weight of that connection. Margaret's eyes glistened now, not from public embarrassment, but from recognition. She remembered nights when she had convinced herself that stepping in would only make things worse. She had chosen neutrality because it felt safer. She had told herself that maintaining calm preserved love. Ethan said that love without advocacy feels conditional. He did not say it harshly. He did not say it loudly. He said it as though it were a fact he had studied carefully. He described how, as an adult, he learned that safety is not defined by the absence of chaos. It is defined by the presence of protection. He paused briefly, letting the distinction linger. Margaret understood that he was not dismantling his father's entire existence. He was isolating one element that had shaped him deeply, and in doing so, he was asking her to confront her own role, not in cruelty, but in silence. Ethan finished this portion of his reflection by saying that truth spoken calmly is not disrespect. It is responsibility. And today, responsibility required him to name what had been left unnamed for far too long. The sanctuary felt suspended in time, as though the outside world had paused to allow this moment to unfold without interruption. Ethan did not step back from the podium. He did not soften his posture. Instead, he allowed a brief silence to pass before continuing, his voice still calm, still measured. He said that when he was younger, he believed that loyalty meant protecting the image of his family at any cost. He defended his father to friends who questioned strictness. He reassured teachers that everything at home was fine. He repeated the same phrases he had heard for years. Structure builds character. High standards create strong men. He internalized those statements so deeply that they became automatic responses. Margaret felt the words echo against memories she had carefully stored away. She remembered conversations with neighbors about discipline and responsibility. She remembered nodding when people complimented Robert's firmness, describing it as dedication. She had participated in that narrative. She had helped maintain it. Ethan continued, explaining that as he grew older, he realized loyalty without honesty is not loyalty at all. It is performance. He said that performance can last for years. It can carry a person through school, through work, through polite family gatherings. But eventually, it begins to erode something essential. He described the first time he openly disagreed with a supervisor at work and did not apologize afterward. It felt foreign, uncomfortable, but also freeing. He recognized that his instinct to stay agreeable had roots far older than his career. The congregation remained still, absorbing each sentence as if it were a carefully placed stone. Margaret's breathing felt shallow now. She remembered the way Ethan used to defend his father during small arguments, stepping in with explanations before she even asked him to. At the time, she had felt relief. She had interpreted his defense as respect. Now she wondered whether it had been adaptation. Ethan said that children often learn to manage adults instead of being managed by them. They anticipate moods. They smooth edges. They take responsibility for maintaining peace. And when one parent stands back, even quietly, that lesson becomes permanent. He paused briefly, his gaze steady. He said he is not here to dismantle the entire memory of his father. He acknowledges that his father provided financially, showed up at school events, worked long hours. But providing a house does not automatically create safety inside it. Margaret felt the distinction land heavily. She had measured love through provision, through meals cooked, through bills paid, through holidays observed without visible conflict. Ethan concluded this portion of his reflection by saying that today is not about erasing a life. It is about refusing to erase his own experience. And for the first time, he is choosing not to protect an image that required him to remain silent. The air in the sanctuary felt charged now, no longer uncertain but undeniably aware. Ethan did not rush to conclude. He did not retreat into safer language. Instead, he allowed his gaze to settle gently on his mother once more before speaking again. He said that for years he believed adulthood would automatically dissolve the past. He thought success would outweigh memory. He thought distance would soften everything into something manageable. But maturity, he learned, does not erase childhood. It clarifies it. He explained that there were moments in his 30s when he considered calling his father to have an honest conversation, to describe what growing up had felt like from his perspective. Each time, he rehearsed the words in his mind, imagining how the conversation might unfold. In every version, he found himself minimizing his own experience before the discussion even began. He realized that the instinct to protect the other person's comfort still outweighed his own need for clarity. Margaret felt a sharp awareness move through her chest. She remembered occasions when Ethan's voice sounded restrained on the phone, as though he were measuring each sentence. She had interpreted that restraint as respect. She had not recognized it as hesitation. Ethan continued, explaining that in recent years he stopped seeking confrontation, not because the past no longer mattered, but because he understood that acknowledgement cannot be forced. Some people are unwilling to examine their own reflection. He accepted that reality. What he could not accept was continuing to protect a version of events that excluded his experience entirely. The congregation remained silent, their attention unwavering. Margaret noticed that no one looked bored or impatient. They looked thoughtful. Some avoided her eyes. Others glanced at her briefly, then back at her son. Ethan said that today he is not asking anyone in this room to choose sides. He is not asking them to reinterpret every memory they hold of his father. He is simply asking that his experience be allowed to exist alongside theirs. He explained that families often preserve harmony by prioritizing the loudest narrative, the strongest personality, the most confident voice. But quiet stories matter too. He paused, allowing the statement to breathe. Margaret felt the weight of that truth more than any previous sentence. For years, she had believed that maintaining balance required silence. She had convinced herself that neutrality was wisdom. Now she understood that neutrality can feel like abandonment to the person standing alone. Ethan concluded this portion of his reflection by saying that he does not stand here seeking revenge. He stands here seeking alignment with his own truth. And alignment, even when delayed, is necessary for peace. The words were calm. They were steady, and they carried more finality than any raised voice ever could.